The war inspired some to a push for a naval academy, similar to the U.S. military academy at West Point. But it was decades before Navy Secretary George Bancroft was able to secure congressional funding for the school in Annapolis, Maryland. The Naval School, with a class of 50, opened in 1845. In 1850, it was renamed the United States Naval Academy. Around this time, in 1846 to 48, the United States was at war with Mexico. The Navy played a key role in two major actions during the war, helping to secure U.S. victory. In 1846, the U.S. Navy's Pacific Squadron, under Commodore Robert Stockton, helped facilitate the capture of California. And in 1847, the U.S. Navy and Army conducted a joint operation, the first large-scale amphibious assault conducted by the U.S. military. The naval force was commanded during the landing by Captain Matthew C. Perry, younger brother to Oliver Perry. Charles Morris described the assault.
In March 1847, a fleet of 70 ships and transports was gathered before this port, conveying the 12,600 men of General Winfield Scott's Army of Invasion. It was decided to make the attack by a combined land and naval force, and land batteries were planted which began the bombardment on March 22, 1847. On March 25, the bombardment of Veracruz ceased at the request of the Mexicans. 3 days afterwards, the city was surrendered.
The war with Mexico would soon end, and as Charles Morris notes,
not many years afterwards, Commodore Perry performed an important work not only for the United States but for the civilized world in the opening of Japan to commerce and friendly intercourse. For several centuries, the island empire of Japan, incensed at the behavior of its first Christian visitors, had closed its ports to the world and remained persistently isolated. After the beginning of the 19th century, several efforts were made by European nations, and particularly by Russia, to put an end to this policy of isolation, but in vain. Commodore Perry succeeded this mission in 1852 and reached Japan in the following year with the steamers Mississippi and Susquehanna and the sailing ships Saratoga and Plymouth. The wall of Japanese isolation thus broken down, all attempts at seclusion were soon given up. The work of Commodore Perry has proved of more advantage to Japan than to any other nation, since that country has emerged from the position of an empire absolutely without influence in the councils of the nations into that of one of the leading powers of the world.
Perry succeeded in his mission to Japan, despite the loss of what had been considered by many an essential tool for maintaining discipline on a ship: flogging offenders with the cat-o'-nine-tails. The cat was made of 9 pieces of cord, with 3 knots tied into the end of each, all tied to a short wooden handle. The captain could order offenders flogged with this upon their bare backs. There were reports of sailors receiving 12 lashes for offenses as minor as spilling ink. In 1850, Congress outlawed flogging. Not surprisingly, many old hands were not happy. An anonymous naval officer wrote an article he titled, "A Plea in Favor of Maintaining Flogging in the Navy."
To prepare ships of war for the services that may be desired of them at any moment, they are carefully provided with heavy armaments, comprising the most improved inventions for the wholesale destruction of human life. And they are thronged with men who are more zealously taught to wield these instruments of death than they ever were to fear God and obey His commandments. And there is always in every ship a knot of abandoned and incorrigible vagabonds, sweepings of the jails and streets, the outcasts of the shore, who herd with the vicious portion of the seamen and form a turbulent and unruly gang, setting at defiance all moderate attempts to govern them, and having the fixed purpose of shirking duty and overturning decency, order, and law on board. The laws for the government of men thus banded together for the purpose of war are necessarily arbitrary and severe. The crew cannot be governed like any civil body because there is not nor can there be any parallel between their different condition.
This concern was felt by far more than this anonymous officer. And during the first few years after flogging was outlawed, reports of insubordination increased as officers sought new and more inventive ways to punish offenders. But Commodore Perry, knowing he had a long journey with few ports of call, chose instead to improve discipline by improving morale. He increased rations, encouraged visits between ships, and even theatrical productions to entertain the crew. His trip was a great success, which would have been impossible with an unruly crew. Perry proved that discipline did not require excessively harsh sanctions. But the Navy's great successes with regard to foreign interests, like Japan and Mexico, were not enough to prevent the United States from being ripped apart by domestic strife. When people think of the Civil War, they generally imagine the great armies of the Union and Confederacy blasting away at each other with cannon and rifle. But the navies played a critical part in the war. Indeed, the ships created for this war and the battles between them would change naval warfare forever. In fact, the battle that began the war involved control of a major harbor. 6 days after South Carolina seceded, and under the cover of darkness, Major Robert Anderson moved his regiment out of the indefensible federal Fort Moultrie and into Fort Sumter. Both forts were in South Carolina's Charleston harbor, but Sumter, still under construction and previously unoccupied, controlled the entrance to the harbor. Anderson was in a better position, but he and his 85 men needed supplies, arms, and reinforcements. President Buchanan ordered civilian merchant vessel the Star of the West to be used to make the delivery, hoping it would be seen as less antagonistic to the Confederates. But as the Star of the West approached Sumter on January 9, 1861, cadets from the Citadel, who were manning the artillery battery on Morris Island, opened fire. Batteries from the now Confederate-held Fort Moultrie joined in, and the ship was forced to withdraw. Months later, South Carolina forces would open fire on Fort Sumter, capturing the fort and beginning the war. In the early days of the war, Union General-in-Chief Winfield Scott proposed a naval blockade as a means of subduing the South. His Anaconda Plan, as it became known, involved using the Union Navy to cut the Confederacy off from the rest of the world. While the plan was not enacted precisely as proposed, the Union Navy would maintain a blockade of the Confederate ports throughout the war, and the Confederate Navy, once it came into existence, would work to help smugglers run the blockade and bring supplies to the southern states. The two most famous ships of the Civil War were the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia. This was the first meeting of ironclad warships, and the whole world took notice. On the first day of the battle, the Virginia, which had been built from the remains of the U.S. wooden warship, the Merrimac, sank 2 wooden Union ships and crippled a third. On the second day, March 9, 1862, the USS Monitor arrived, and the two ironclads hammered at each other, eventually concluding in a draw. Confederate Colonel John Taylor Wood wrote of the reaction to their confrontation, the Battle of Hampton Roads.
The engagement in Hampton Roads was in some respect the most momentous naval conflict ever witnessed. No battle was ever more widely discussed or produced a greater sensation. It revolutionized the navies of the world. Line of battle ships, those huge overgrown craft, carrying from 80 to 120 guns and from 500 to 1,200 men, which from the destruction of the Spanish Armada to our time had done most of the fighting, decided the fate of empires, were at once universally condemned as out of date. Rams and ironclads were in future to decide all naval warfare.
After the Battle of Hampton Roads, both sides built more ironclads. The Union, in particular, was able to build a sizable force of 50 Monitor-class ships. The following month, the Union Navy, with a small contingent of Marines, had a more clear-cut victory with the capture of New Orleans. Charles Morris described the campaign.
An attack on New Orleans was suggested to the Navy Department by Commander David D. Porter, who proposed as leader of the expedition David G. Farragut, midshipman under his father in the old Essex 50 years before. The suggestion was accepted and Farragut appointed flag officer of the fleet, and on February 20, 1862, he reached Ship Island near the mouth of the Great River of the West. Beginning April 18, for 6 days the mortar boats kept up a steady fire, while on the 20th, Lieutenant Caldwell in the gunboat Itasca made a dash upon the river chain, which he succeeded in breaking. At 2 o'clock on the morning of the 24th of April, the advance up the river began. The mortar boats poured shells into Fort Jackson in a steady stream. The fight with the Confederate vessels was more severe than that with the forts. The Cayuga, the first to encounter them, was soon reinforced by others, and for some time a brisk battle went on. The Louisiana proved of little service, and the Manassas, after a vigorous effort to ram some of the Union ships, was run ashore and abandoned by her crew. The battle ended in the flight of the unhurt Confederate craft, the Union fleet following triumphantly up the stream and reaching the levees of New Orleans at 1 o'clock in the afternoon of April 25.
Farragut demanded the surrender of New Orleans. The city rejected his demand at first, but finally did surrender on April 28th. The capture of New Orleans was a resounding victory, for which Congress honored Farragut by promoting him to Rear Admiral. Farragut is perhaps a bit more famous, however, for his words at the Battle of Mobile Bay. Historian Mabel Beebe wrote of the action at Mobile Bay in August 1864.
A double line of torpedoes, or submarine mines, was stretched across the channel. Above this lay the Confederate fleet. One of these vessels, the Tennessee, was a huge iron ram like the Merrimac. The squadron of Admiral Farragut was a strong one. There were 24 wooden war vessels and 4 ironclads, like the Monitor. The 4 ironclads were sent ahead close to the forts. The wooden war vessels followed, lashed together in pairs. This was done so that if one vessel became disabled, it could be towed by the other. Farragut wished to lead the fleet in his flagship, the Hartford, but his officers dissuaded him, and the Brooklyn went first. The Hartford followed.
During the battle, Admiral Farragut climbed high up into the rigging so that he could see past the blinding smoke. Fearing that the admiral might fall from the height, one of his men eventually had to tie Farragut to the rigging.
The ironclad Tecumseh was now leading the fleet. Suddenly there was a muffled explosion. The stern of the Tecumseh rose out of the water and she plunged bow foremost to the bottom of the channel. This was a critical moment of the battle. The backing of the Brooklyn caused confusion among the vessels following so closely upon each other. There was tremendous cheering and firing from the Confederates. They were sure that the victory was theirs.
Farragut was unwilling to give them that victory. Famously, he called out, "Damn the torpedoes! Full speed ahead!" Despite these great naval battles, most of the water-based combat of the Civil War was not on the open seas, but along the nation's vast network of rivers. The so-called Brown Water Navy of Union River boats drove down the Mississippi River, capturing major cities and forts. When they captured Vicksburg and Port Hudson, they had complete command of the Mississippi, cutting the Confederacy in half. Union Rear Admiral Henry Walk wrote of the gunboats that the Union used so effectively.
During the spring and summer of 1861, Commander John Rodgers purchased, altered, equipped, and manned, for immediate service on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, 3 wooden gunboats: the Tyler, of 6 8-inch shell guns and 2 32-pounders, the Lexington of 4 8-inch shell guns and 2 32-pounders, and the Conestoga of 4 32-pounder guns. This nucleus of the Mississippi flotilla was completed with great skill and dispatch. They soon had full possession of the western rivers above Columbus, Kentucky, and rendered more important service than as many regiments could have done. On October 12, 1861, the St. Louis, afterward known as DeKalb, the first of the ironclad gunboats, was launched. The other ironclads were launched soon after. On the evening of the 6th of November, 1861, I received instructions from General Grant to proceed down the Mississippi with the wooden gunboats Tyler and Lexington on a reconnaissance, and as convoy to some half a dozen transport steamers. But I did not know the character of the service expected of me until I anchored for the night, 7 or 8 miles below Cairo. Early the next morning, while the troops were being landed near Belmont, Missouri, I attacked the Confederate batteries as a diversion. Soon after we returned to the landing place, our troops began to appear. The Confederates came en masse through a cornfield and opened with musketry and light artillery upon the transports, which were filled or being filled with our retreating soldiers. A well-directed fire from the gunboats made the enemy fly in the greatest confusion.
The river gunboats provided critical support to troops in the Western Theater throughout the war. During the Civil War, the Navy, which had historically been less racially segregated than the Army, had black sailors in its ranks even before the Emancipation Proclamation. Former slaves and free blacks served with distinction in the Union Navy. Men like Robert Blake. Blake had been a slave in South Carolina until he was freed in 1862 by Union forces. He then volunteered to serve on Navy ships, eventually serving as a steward on the gunboat USS Marblehead. On Christmas Day, 1863, the Marblehead was shelled by Confederate artillery on Johns Island, South Carolina. An explosion knocked Blake to the deck, and when he rose, he saw the powder boy who had been manning a gun had been killed. Although he was not serving in a combat role, Blake took over the powder boy's job, carrying gunpowder boxes to the artillery loaders throughout the battle. For his actions under fire, Robert Blake was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor.